Okay, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about some of the cultural influences of the 1920s. Um, During the 1920s, the culture in the United States was certainly undergoing a significant shift. And probably one of the most significant shifts had to do with how we dealt with our children. Prior to the 1920s, most people in the United States attended public school, uh, perhaps just through elementary school, maybe up to eighth grade, but most people didn't attend high school. That changes significantly after the during the 1920s, and then after, schooling becomes one of the most common experiences in our nation. Everybody attends school. In fact, all the way up through high school. By the end of the 1920s, more than half of the teenage um, residents of the United States attended high school, 4 million people in 1926. The taxes, in order to pay for this, also increased. Our taxes double in six, or the amount we spend on education, doubles in 6 years to 2.7 billion per year is what the average comes out for the 1920s. That's half as much as the rest of the world combined. So we are spending vast amounts to educate and teach our population. The curriculum also is changing drastically. Our high schools and our elementary schools, in fact, but mostly our high schools offer more and more courses. Specifically, they start to expand on what is called vocational training. Those would be things like your auto shop classes, your wood shop classes, your metals classes. Those would all be considered vocational training, not in an academic realm, but in a real world skill that could be applied to a future job or trade. You expanded course offerings in things like home economics, teaching kids how to sew and how to cook, and those become things that the schools take over and begin teaching. Also, we get a change in the way we consume our news. We have more and more coverage during the 1920s due to developments like new magazines, such as Time. Time magazine is published for the first time in 1923, and of course is still a popular magazine today. We get the development of new mediums to communicate. We aren't just limited to print any longer. A new development, a new piece of technology comes out, the radio, and for the first time, radio stations begin to broadcast across the United States. And at the time, most of those radio stations were nothing more than advertising for major retail chains, and they would go ahead and a radio station could broadcast in New York, and they'd have a powerful enough transmitter to broadcast all the way to California. We don't have that anymore, but really that's how the radio begins. You also get the development of tabloids, sensationalist newspapers, more or less, that basically the crazier the headline, the better. That they just want to attract readers. But the biggest development that tabloids bring is the development of photography. Um, Prior to the 1920s, while photography was possible, we couldn't really or didn't often use it to print pictures in newspapers. During the 1920s, in large part because of tabloids, that becomes popularized. And for the first time, we start to be able to see with our own eyes the people that we're reading about, whether they be presidents, celebrities, athletes. And so, really, one of the big cultural shifts because of this is the birth of celebrity. Really, prior to the 1920s, there weren't celebrities. You could be, a great baseball player, you could be a politician, and you could still walk down the street in relative anonymity. People didn't know what you looked like for the most part. People didn't know who you were. Well, when we start printing pictures in newspapers, people do now know who you are. They know what Babe Ruth looks like. They know what Charles Lindbergh looks like. Charles Lindbergh, of course, famous for being the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic, and becomes an enormous celebrity because of that accomplishment. Because everybody could look in the newspaper and see who he was. So when he walked down the street, people recognized him. When Babe Ruth walked down the street, people recognized him. Of course, Babe Ruth, one of the most famous baseball players in the history of the game, sets a record in 1927, hitting 60 home runs that will stand for 40 years. Wins 7 pennants, 7 championships with the Yankees, and is part of one of the most famous lineups in history, Murderers Row, um, because you couldn't pitch around it. Included guys like Lou Gehrig and different things like that. It was an amazing lineup of baseball players. Other celebrities in football, guys like Red Grange; in boxing, guys like Jack Dempsey. Movies also make their premiere really in the 1920s, and Hollywood becomes a significant cultural force during the 1920s as a result of people like Charlie Chaplin, who begins his career in silent films with his most famous character, the Little Tramp, but ends his career founding a studio, United Artists, which is still, of course, a studio today, and was really a cooperative effort between a lot of the film industry leaders, the actors, and things like that, led by Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin's career ends because of another technological advancement in movies, the talking movie. The first talking movie, The Jazz Singer, comes out in 1927. Prior to talking movies, the way movies were done, you didn't hear people talk, and there'd be somebody in the theater who was playing a piano that had a score that went along with the movie, and that was played live as the movie went. That changes with the Jazz Singer, the 1927. Now you can hear the actors talk, and so now it not only matters can they act, but it matters can they talk. Writers also become hugely significant. Well, in fact, are hugely significant throughout our history, um, but they continue that in the 1920s. For the most part, a lot of your more influential writers were really social critics. They criticized the materialism of the 1920s and how we were obsessed with the next greatest thing and with fashion. They criticized war, especially coming off of World War I. A lot of the writers were adversely affected by that. They criticized business and society. A lot of your muckraking journalists of the progressive era are influential here. Guys like F. Scott Fitzgerald, again criticizing the materialism of his generation, writes a book called The Great Gatsby, which highlights this. And Ernest Hemingway, another one of the most influential writers of this time period, is absolutely obsessed with opposing warfare and writes a book, Farewell to Arms, which again is a kind of an expose and a critique of World War I and Hemingway's experience there. Writes a book called Old Man and the Sea. Old Man and the Sea, quick 60-second or less synopsis. Old guy gets in a boat, goes out, catches big fish, reels it in. Fish pulls him out to sea. Man has to try to row back. Fish is too big to fit in the boat, lashes the fish to the side of the boat. Sharks eat the fish. Man gets back. Nobody believes he caught the fish. Old Man and the Sea, there you go. Ironically enough, as opposed, even though Hemingway was opposed to war and to the violence there, loves bullfighting, is obsessed with it, is an avid bullfighting fan for his entire life. Famously goes and lives kind of apart from society down in the Florida Keys. So an interesting character. Okay, if you want to go ahead and pause it now, there's a few questions. See if you can quiz yourself a little bit and see what kind of things you remember from the section. Thanks a lot.